the weapon that kills the wielder. It is the ultimate paradox of statecraft, a weapon designed to suffocate the enemy without firing a single shot, yet one that frequently strangles the hand that wields it. We are told that economic sanctions are the civilized alternative to war, a precise scalpel used by superpowers to cut off rogue states from the lifeblood of global commerce. But history tells a different, far more brutal story. From the marble halls of ancient trade empires to the digital ledgers of modern central banks, the act of denying trade has repeatedly triggered the collapse of the very superpowers enforcing the blockade. What happens when the unbeatable economic weapon creates a new enemy, one that is immune to your money, your banks, and your rules? To understand this self-inflicted destruction, we must look past the headlines and into the machinery of economic dependency. When a superpower weaponizes its currency or its trade routes, it relies on a single, fragile assumption that the target has no other choice. It assumes a monopoly on survival. But markets, like water, are relentless. Block a river here, and it carves a new path there, often a path that bypasses the dam entirely. In the pursuit of financial strangulation, empires inadvertently force their enemies to innovate, to build parallel systems, and to forge alliances that would have been impossible in peacetime. This sanction is not a modern invention. It is as old as the concept of the siege. However, the scale of catastrophe it invites is unique to interconnected economies. When a dominant power removes a player from the game board, they do not disappear, they simply start a new game. This creates a shadow economy, a black market that grows so large it eventually competes with the legitimate one. By pushing rogue nations into the dark, the superpower loses its ability to surveil, regulate, or tax them. The light of the empire dims, while the shadows grow rich. Furthermore, the psychological toll of sanctions often galvanizes the target population rather than breaking them. Instead of blaming their leaders for the hardship, the people turn their rage outward toward the foreign aggressor. It is the rally round the flag effect, painted in the blood and sweat of the working class. The blockade, intended to cause internal revolution, instead cements the tyrant's power. The superpower is left with a starving population that hates them, a strengthened dictator, and a broken trade network that used to generate their own wealth. As we journey through this documentary, we will dissect the anatomy of these failures. We will witness the arrogance of Napoleon, the miscalculations of the British Empire, and the terrifying parallels to our modern dollar-based financial system. We are standing on the precipice of a new era, where the overuse of sanctions threatens to shatter the global economy into fragmented, warring blocks. The question is no longer, will sanctions work? But rather, will the sanctioner survive the recoil? The Continental Trap, Napoleon's Folly. History provides no clearer warning than the Continental System of 1806. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, believed he could bring Great Britain to its knees not by invasion, but by bankruptcy. His decree was absolute. No European nation under French control could trade with the British. It was the 19th century equivalent of a total trade embargo. On paper, it was a death sentence for an island nation dependent on exports. In reality, it was a suicide pact for the French Empire. The logic seemed sound to the emperor. Britain was a nation of shopkeepers. Deny them customers, and the shop closes. But Napoleon forgot that trade is a two-way street. By cutting off British goods, he also cut off the raw materials Europe needed to function. French industries, starved of cotton, indigo, and sugar, began to suffocate. The cost of living in Paris soared. The protection Napoleon offered his allies felt more like a prison sentence, breeding resentment among the very nations he sought to lead. This economic warfare turned allies into inmates. Smuggling became the most profitable industry in Europe. It was said that a man could walk from Hamburg to Naples wearing entirely British wool, smoking British tobacco, all while carrying a French passport. The blockade was so porous it became a farce. Even Napoleon's own army, desperate for quality uniforms and boots, quietly purchased supplies from British smugglers. The emperor was effectively funding his own enemy to clothe his soldiers. This highlights the inevitable failure of centralized market control. The political fallout was even deadlier. To enforce this leaky blockade, Napoleon had to invade countries that refused to comply, most notably Portugal and Russia. This obsession led him directly into the Peninsular War and the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. The continental system, designed to save French blood, became the primary cause of its spilling. The economic weapon did not act as a shield. It acted as a lure, drawing the emperor into conflicts he could not win. Napoleon's failure illustrates the fundamental flaw of sanctions: enforceability. Unless you control the entire world, there is always a backdoor. And in trying to close every backdoor, the sanctioner overextends, exhausting their resources and political capital. Britain, meanwhile, pivoted to new markets in the Americas and Asia, growing richer while Europe stagnated. The blockade didn't isolate Britain, it isolated Napoleon. The League of Failures, Mussolini's defiance. Fast forward to 1935, and the world had replaced emperors with institutions. The League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, faced its first true test of economic sanctions when Benito Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League, desperate to avoid another world war, chose the humane option: financial penalties rather than military intervention. They believed that by cutting off loans and certain imports, they could starve the fascist war machine into submission. They were disastrously wrong. The sanctions imposed were half-hearted and riddled with loopholes. Crucially, the League did not ban oil exports to Italy, fearing that such a move would provoke Mussolini into a wider war or drive him into the arms of non-League members. The result was the worst of both worlds. The sanctions were strong enough to enrage the Italian public, but too weak to stop the Italian army. It was a lesson in the dangers of partial embargoes. They annoy the aggressor without disabling them. The psychological impact on Italy was profound. Mussolini used the sanctions as a propaganda masterstroke. He painted Italy as the victim of a jealous, hypocritical conspiracy by the wealthy British and French empires. He launched the Gold for the Fatherland campaign, where millions of Italian women, including the Queen, publicly donated their wedding rings to the state to melt down for the war effort. The sanctions did not isolate Mussolini, they sanctified him. They turned a war of aggression into a war of national survival. Economically, the sanctions forced Italy to pursue autarky, complete self-sufficiency. While inefficient, this drive for independence made Italy more resilient to future external pressure. More dangerously, it severed Italy's economic ties with the democracies of the West and pushed it toward the only other major power that didn't care about the League's rules: Nazi Germany. Hitler watched closely, realizing that the Western powers lacked the stomach for a real fight. The League of Nations collapsed shortly thereafter, its credibility shattered. The attempt to substitute financial warfare for military commitment had failed. The lesson for the modern observer is stark. Half measures in economic warfare often accelerate the very alliances you fear most. By trying to punish Italy without paying a cost themselves, the Allies guaranteed that when the real war came, they would face a united Axis front. The trust deficit, crossing the Rubicon. If 2012 was the warning shot, 2022 was the declaration of total war. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the G7 nations took the unprecedented step of freezing the sovereign assets of the Russian central bank, over $300 billion held in Western jurisdictions. This was a Rubicon moment in economic history. Never before had a nuclear power and G20 economy seen its national savings confiscated. It shattered the sacred tenet of central banking, that reserves are neutral, safe, and inviolable, regardless of war or peace. The immediate economic damage to Russia was severe, but the message sent to the rest of the world was even more profound. Leaders in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, and Brasilia watched in horror. They realized that their trillions in dollar reserves, money they had earned by selling real goods, were not truly theirs. They were merely IOUs that could be canceled if they ever disagreed with Western foreign policy. The risk-free asset was suddenly fraught with geopolitical risk. This destroyed the trust premium of the Western financial system. Trust takes decades to build and seconds to destroy. By weaponizing the very foundation of global savings, the West signaled that the rule of law is secondary to geopolitical objectives. Critics argued that this was necessary to punish aggression, but financial realists argued it was a strategic blunder. It incentivized the global South to diversify away from Western currencies, not out of malice, but out of basic fiduciary duty. The fear factor is palpable. If the US can freeze the assets of a nuclear-armed Russia, what chance does a smaller nation have? This has accelerated the search for sanction-resistant assets. Central banks bought a record amount of gold in 2022 and 2023. Gold is the only financial asset that is not someone else's liability. It has no counterparty risk. It cannot be frozen by a decree in Washington or Brussels. We are witnessing a return to the oldest form of money because the newest form has been weaponized. The freezing of reserves marked the end of the era of globalized finance. We have moved into an era of friendshoring and financial blocks. Capital is no longer flowing to where it is most efficient. It is flowing to where it is politically safe. The efficiency of the global market is being sacrificed for security. The sanction intended to isolate Russia has, in a cruel twist of irony, isolated the West from the trust of the emerging world. The alternative architecture, the rise of BRICS. Nature abhors a vacuum, and markets abhor a bottleneck. Faced with the weaponization of the dollar and SWIFT, the world's emerging powers are building a parallel system. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, has expanded, inviting major energy producers like Iran and the UAE. Their goal is clear: to create a financial immune system that can withstand Western sanctions. They are constructing the lifeboats for the post-dollar world. The cornerstone of this new architecture is alternative payment systems. China has developed CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, and Russia has built SBFS. While these systems currently handle a fraction of SWIFT's volume, they are growing rapidly. They allow nations to settle trade in yuan, rubles, or rupees, completely bypassing the US banking system. For the first time in decades, it is possible to buy Saudi oil or Brazilian soy without touching a single US dollar. The monopoly is broken. Furthermore, we are seeing the rise of petro-yuan and other commodity-backed trade deals. China, the world's factory, is paying for energy in its own currency. To assuage fears about holding yuan, China effectively allows those yuan to be converted into gold on the Shanghai exchange. This links the currency to tangible assets. It is a direct challenge to the fiat dollar system. The emerging world is saying, we will trade real things for real things, not for your debt. This shift is not just about avoiding sanctions. It is about de-dollarization. Every trade settled in a non-dollar currency reduces the global demand for dollars. This weakens the impact of future US sanctions. If a country doesn't need dollars to buy food or energy, threatening to cut off their dollar access becomes an empty threat. The stick of economic warfare is shrinking, and the carrot of Western market access is becoming less exclusive. The development of this alternative architecture ensures that the next time a major power is sanctioned, the impact will be significantly muted. The world is bifurcating into two spheres: the dollar sphere and the commodity sphere. The irony is palpable. Sanctions were designed to enforce a rules-based international order. Instead, they have catalyzed the creation of a new order where the sanctioners make the rules only for themselves. The post-dollar world? We have arrived at the precipice of a new economic epoch. The cycle that began with Napoleon's blockade is repeating itself, but this time, the stakes are not just territory. They are the very architecture of global finance. Today, the continental system is the US dollar, and the blockade is digital. But just as 19th century Europe found ways to bypass French decrees, the 21st century world is furiously building a lifeboat to escape the reach of Western sanctions. The weapon has been fired so many times that the barrel is beginning to melt. The danger lies in the rapid de-dollarization of the global economy. For decades, the structural demand for dollars allowed the United States to run massive deficits and enjoy cheap imports. It was an economic gravity that held the world together. But if sanctions force major economies like China, Russia, and India to trade in their own currencies, that gravity reverses. The trillions of dollars held overseas could flood back home, triggering hyperinflation that no central bank can tame. The sanction that was meant to crush a foreign rival could end up crushing the domestic consumer. Moreover, we are witnessing the bifurcation of the world. We are moving from a single globalized economy to two distinct blocks: the Western financial sphere, capital, and the Eastern commodity sphere, resources. One holds the banks, the other holds the oil, food, and metals. In a long-term economic war, History favors those who control the tangible assets over those who control the ledger entries. You cannot eat a bank transfer. You cannot heat a home with a credit rating. The real economy is reasserting its dominance over the financial economy. The tragedy of this trajectory is that sanctions were intended to prevent war. By severing economic ties, we ironically make kinetic war more likely. When nations trade, they have a mutual interest in peace. The McDonald's theory of peace suggests that countries with intertwined economies rarely fight. When that trade is severed, the opportunity cost of conflict drops to zero. We are dismantling the peace treaties of commerce, brick by brick, under the guise of moral enforcement. We are creating a world with less leverage, less communication, and far more volatility. As we look back at the wreckage of past economic wars, the lesson is clear. Interdependence is a double-edged sword. You cannot starve your neighbor without risking your own harvest. The superpowers of the future will not be those who can weaponize their economy the most aggressively, but those who can build the most resilient bridges. The era of the sanction may well be the era that ends the superpower. History is a ledger that eventually balances itself, and the debt of weaponized finance is coming due. If you want to understand the deep mechanics of how money shapes history, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are building a library of economic lessons that schools often skip. Comment below. Do you think the dollar's dominance is ending, or is it too big to fail? Let the debate begin. The target strikes back, the 1973 oil shock. If the League of Nations proved that sanctions could be too weak, the 1973 oil crisis proved that the target can sometimes sanction the superpower. For the first time in modern history, the peripheral nations, the producers of raw materials, realized they held the knife. In response to U.S. support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab members of OPEC did not fire missiles at Washington. They simply turned off the tap. It was the first global demonstration of commodity power versus financial power. The embargo sent shockwaves through the industrialized world. The price of oil quadrupled overnight. The United States, the world's economic engine, sputtered and stalled. Inflation skyrocketed, and the stock market crashed. It was a brutal wake-up call. A superpower's military might is useless if its tanks have no fuel and its factories have no power. The OPEC embargo revealed that in a globalized economy, the weak nations often control the critical nodes of the strong nation's survival. However, the boomerang effect returned to hit the producers as well. The sudden wealth transfer to the Middle East was massive, but the high prices forced the West to adapt. It triggered a desperate race for energy efficiency and alternative sources. The U.S. invested in Alaskan oil. Europe turned to nuclear power and North Sea gas. Japanese car manufacturers, who built smaller, fuel-efficient vehicles, decimated the American auto industry. This response permanently altered the global energy landscape. By weaponizing oil, OPEC inadvertently destroyed the long-term demand monopoly they once enjoyed. They taught their customers to live without them, or at least to live with less of them. This illustrates a key rule of economic warfare. If you make a commodity too expensive or too political, the market will spend billions to design you out of existence. The 1973 crisis also birthed the petrodollar system. In the aftermath, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, military protection in exchange for pricing oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. This masterstroke re-cemented American financial dominance, turning a moment of weakness into a foundation of strength. But today, as sanctions are used again, that foundation is cracking. The lesson of 1973 remains. The resource producer has leverage, but the innovator has longevity. The fortress economy, the siege of autarky. When a country is sanctioned, we assume it will collapse. But what if it decides to simply close the doors? Enter the fortress economy. Nations like Cuba and North Korea provide a fascinating, if tragic, case study in economic survivalism. Cut off from global trade for decades, these regimes did not fall. Instead, they mutated. They developed a siege mentality, where suffering became a badge of honor and the lack of luxury goods was reframed as resistance against imperialism. In these fortress economies, the black market becomes the only market. When the formal banking system is blocked, value moves underground. In North Korea, a sophisticated network of smuggling, cyber theft, and illicit trade keeps the elite funded while the populace starves. Sanctions here act as a filter. They successfully block the import of food and medicine for the poor, but fail to block the import of luxury cognac and Mercedes-Benz parts for the leadership. The unintended consequence of total isolation is that the sanctioning power loses all leverage. Once you have sanctioned everything, you have nothing left to threaten. You cannot take away what a nation no longer has. These regimes have become sanction-proof, not because they are rich, but because they have learned to survive at rock bottom. They have no integration with the global economy to lose. Furthermore, this isolation breeds a dangerous kind of innovation. Denied conventional weapons trade, these nations turn to asymmetric threats, nuclear weapons development. The sanctions on North Korea were intended to stop their nuclear program. Instead, they accelerated it. With no economic future to offer its people, the regime staked its legitimacy on military might. The blockade didn't disarm the enemy. It convinced them that the bomb was their only guarantee of survival. The fortress economy teaches us that economic pain does not always translate to political change. Pain can be normalized. Regimes can adapt to a baseline of poverty that would cause a revolution in a Western democracy. By severing ties, the West often creates a hermit kingdom that is deaf to diplomacy, immune to shame, and dangerous to its neighbors. The walls we build to keep them and also keep us out. To understand modern economic sanctions, we must first understand the weapon itself, the United States dollar. In 1944, at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the victors of World War II designed a new global financial architecture. They crowned the dollar as the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold, while all other currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was a system built on trust and stability. But in doing so, the world effectively handed the keys to the global vault to a single nation. For decades, this arrangement facilitated trade, but it also planted the seeds of a monopoly that would eventually be weaponized. This exorbitant privilege, as the French finance minister later called it, allowed the U.S. to print money to pay for its imports, a luxury no other nation enjoyed. But the true shift occurred in 1971, when President Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed only by faith in the U.S. government. Crucially, through the petrodollar system, oil, the world's most essential commodity, could only be bought with greenbacks. This forced every central bank on Earth to hoard dollars just to survive. The dollar ceased to be merely money. It became the oxygen of the global economy. For years, this dominance was viewed as a neutral utility, like the internet or the oceans. Countries traded in dollars because it was convenient, stable, and liquid. But the infrastructure of this trade, the plumbing of the financial world, was owned by New York. Every transaction, whether between China and Brazil or Germany and Russia, eventually passed through a U.S. correspondent bank. This gave the United States jurisdiction over virtually every major trade deal on the planet. The trap was set, even if the world didn't yet realize it. This centralization created a single point of failure for any nation that crossed Washington. In the past, a blockade required ships to physically surround a port, a costly and dangerous endeavor. In the dollarized era, a blockade requires only a keystroke. The financial hegemony of the U.S. meant that it could turn off a nation's ability to transact as easily as flipping a light switch. The physical siege was replaced by the digital exile. As we moved into the 21st century, the temptation to use this power grew. Why send soldiers to die in foreign lands when you can simply freeze the enemy's bank accounts? The dollar transformed from a medium of exchange into a tool of foreign policy. But as we will see, turning a neutral utility into a weapon violates the trust that sustains it. The world accepted the dollar because it was useful. They fear it now because it is dangerous. And fear is a powerful motivator for finding alternatives. Weaponizing the banks, the invisible blockade. The turning point was September 11, 2001. In the hunt for terrorists, the U.S. government realized that the most effective way to stop violent non-state actors was to cut off their funding. The Patriot Act and subsequent regulations forced global banks to act as deputies for U.S. intelligence. The SWIFT system, the messaging network that connects thousands of banks, became a tool of surveillance. For the first time, financial data was weaponized to track and freeze assets, not just of terrorists, but eventually of rival nations. This era gave birth to smart sanctions. Unlike the blunt trade embargoes of the past that starved populations, like in Iraq in the 1990s, these measures targeted specific individuals, companies, and government officials. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, became one of the most powerful agencies in the world. By placing a name on this specially designated nationals list, OFAC could make a person chemically radioactive to the global banking system. No bank, anywhere, would touch them for fear of losing access to the US dollar. The power of these financial sanctions lies in their extraterritoriality. The US began fining foreign banks billions of dollars for processing transactions that were legal in their own countries but illegal under US sanctions. European banks, fearing the loss of their Wall Street licenses, complied instantly. This effectively imposed US foreign policy on the entire world. A French company could not trade with Iran, not because France forbade it, but because the US Treasury did. Sovereignty was eroded by the need for dollar clearing. The efficacy was undeniable. In 2012, when the US and EU disconnected Iranian banks from SWIFT, Iran's oil exports plummeted, and its currency collapsed. It forced Iran to the negotiating table for the nuclear deal. This success convinced Washington that financial warfare was the ultimate low-cost, high-reward strategy. It was clean, bloodless, and devastating. But it bred hubris. Policymakers began to view sanctions as the solution to every geopolitical problem, from human rights violations to border disputes. However, the frequency of these strikes began to dull the blade. The more the US used the SWIFT weapon, the more rival nations realized they were living in a glass house controlled by a landlord who could evict them at any moment. The weaponization of finance created a compliance fatigue globally. It laid the groundwork for the current crisis, where major powers are actively seeking to unplug themselves from the matrix of Western finance to ensure their own survival.